As we finished the last screencast, we talked about the issues that brought on the Great Compromise, and that main issue was representation in the lower house, in the House of Representatives. So as we look at this next slide, we can sort of see a modern day representation of the Great Compromise. The states which have larger populations have more of a voice in the House of Representatives. In the United States Senate, everyone is equal. All the states, no matter the size, have two. So those are the two main parts of that compromise. So now that we have that, we have to move on to the next and last compromise that was at the beginnings of our country, and that would be the 3/5 compromise. The issue that the 3/5 compromise dealt with is now that you're going to have one of the two houses, one of the two bodies in Congress, in the legislative branch, based upon population, the question now becomes, how do you count slaves in southern states? The two sides of the issue are pretty clear. Northern states and southern states have diverging opinions of how to count slaves. Northern states, as it says, oppose counting any slaves in the population count of any southern states. And obviously, Southerners wanted to count all the slaves in their population count because it would benefit them in their numbers and standing in the House of Representatives. Northern states, all 13, had had slavery at one point, but as the years had drug on, many northern states, had basically gotten rid of and reduced slavery to very small numbers, that their states did not have a large segment of their population as slaves. So they opposed southern states who viewed African slaves as property to now use those people, on the other hand, to generate larger numbers so they could get an advantage in their population count. Look at this next slide. This is really interesting. 1790 census records show you slave populations in the states. Now, I know that the bottom one is cut off down here, and I apologize for that. Give me 1 second. We're back here. You can look and see the highlighted ones obviously are southern states. You can see the percentage that they make up. So South Carolina, 42% of their population were African slaves. Virginia, very close, 39%. And then you look at all these New England states, okay, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Delaware was maybe one of the highest but it is a southern state as well because slavery did exist there. So you can sort of see the two sides here. Without the population of their slaves, southern states would basically be at a disadvantage. Northern states understood they could not create this union without southern states. And so a compromise was hatched, was created. And so here it is. They debated numbers, and yes, they debated fractions. And so if you look at this, 3/5 compromise meant that for every 5 slaves, those slaves would now count as 3 free persons to the total population of that state. That is the only part as it relates to African slaves. Many students believe that this had somehow some connection with voting. No, not at all. This was purely using the slaves as basically population markers to increase their numbers in southern states. Northern states also had to make a compromise with southern states because some felt that they should move forward on some type of position on the institution of slavery, but what they came up with was this. They finally agreed not to interfere with the slave trade for 20 years, pretty much in 1808. The international slave trade will end in the United States, meaning there will not be slaves brought in from other places. Slaves will basically only be generated from that slave population already existing in the United States of America. I asked a question concerning, was there a Bill of Rights in the original Constitution? And the simple answer is no. No, there was not. Now, the men had debated this issue. They had come from states where there were state Bill of Rights, but a national Bill of Rights was not included in the original. When the Constitution would go out to all the states, that issue would be at the center of those people who objected to this new plan of government, this new Constitution, that there was not a statement of individual citizens' rights as they pertain to government power. So, due to that, there were 3 men who refused to sign the Bill of Rights, and that was a question on that Google sheet that I'd sent out to you. 3 men are a man from Massachusetts. His name was Elbridge Gerry, Edmund Randolph, the very man who actually presented the Virginia plan, and George Mason. George Mason was pretty much the guy who drew up Bill of Rights, but they did not want to enter into a discussion about that. So, those are the 3 men who actually refused to sign the Constitution because it lacked that very basic protection. Some students ask, why did they not put it in? And within 3 years, there will be a Bill of Rights. And the simple question is great, and the answer is probably very simple, that they were probably tired. They had been there for 4 months. So, the end of the convention comes, and you have George Washington sitting in this chair for the last 4 months. And Ben Franklin has been staring at that chair on and off and just looking at it. Occasionally, as Washington would get out of his seat and wander around the room and talk to people. And he saw this design, he saw this chair, and he saw the comments about the sun. I don't know if you can see that there. And he always thought to himself, is that a rising sun or is it a setting sun? And at the end, he felt not everything in the Constitution was great, but he thought it was a pretty good plan. But he was definitely under the understanding that this would be a rising sun. So I put this in here to sort of show you the chair up close. This picture at the end of the convention is somewhat based in fact, meaning here you have George Washington at the front of the hall, and the men are gathering to sign the document. So this is actually true. Unlike the Declaration of Independence, these men did put their names to the document all together pretty much, and the delegates signed it on what today is celebrated as Constitution Day. September 17th is that anniversary. So we talked about those 3 people who refused to sign it because of the Bill of Rights, but now you have to understand, since they had created this did not make it the new Constitution, new law of the land. It had to go out to the states. So as it goes out to the states, they must begin this process of what is known as ratifying or approving the document that these men proposed. It is not yet the law of the land. Those states would hold conventions, and in each one they would vote to either accept it or reject it. And in your reading you read, this is going to be different than the Articles. Once 9 of the 13 states agree to it, it becomes the new Constitution of the United States of America.